I held my newborn daughter for the first time, while my husband stood in the corner of that hospital room and told me he wouldn't sign her birth certificate because she didn't look white enough. Let me say that again, because even 2 years later, I can barely believe it happened. My husband, the man I'd been married to for 4 years, the man I'd spent 2 years trying to conceive with, looked at our 6-hour-old baby girl and accused me of infidelity. Not because of anything I'd done, but because her skin was a few shades darker than his precious expectations. My name's Fallon. I'm a graphic designer from Austin, and that day in the delivery room should have been the happiest moment of my life. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly who I'd married. And trust me, the man I thought I knew, he didn't exist. I need to tell you this story. Not because I want sympathy, I'm way past that. But because what happened next, what the doctor said that made Trevor freeze in his tracks, it changed everything. And if there's even one woman out there going through something similar, feeling crazy or alone, or wondering if she's overreacting, I want her to know she's not. This is a long story, and honestly, it still hurts to tell parts of it. But I'm going to walk you through every moment, from the pregnancy he couldn't be bothered to show up for, to the 18 hours of labor I went through with only my best friend holding my hand, to the moment that doctor opened a file and exposed the truth that should have been obvious all along. And what I did after? Well, let's just say Trevor wasn't the only one capable of making life-changing decisions. So, if you want to hear how a man's prejudice cost him everything, and how I built something better from the ashes, follow along with these stories. You won't want to miss what comes next. Because this is just the beginning. Trevor and I met at a tech conference in Dallas 5 years before Arya was born. He was charming, confident, made me laugh with stories about coding disasters and office politics. We dated for a year before he proposed at some fancy restaurant downtown, got married 6 months later in a small ceremony. Looking back, I realize I fell in love with the version of himself he performed for me, not the man he actually was. The first 2 years of marriage were fine. Not perfect, but fine. We both worked demanding jobs, him at a software company, me at a design agency. We'd talk about having kids someday, but it was always someday. Vague, distant, comfortable. Then I turned 25, and something shifted in me. I wanted a family. I wanted that chaos and love and permanence. Trevor agreed, said he was ready too. So, we started trying. Month after month, nothing. Negative test after negative test. I tracked everything obsessively: ovulation, temperature, timing. Trevor complained that it felt clinical, that the pressure was killing the mood, but he never suggested stopping. He just got more distant, more irritable. Finally, after 2 years, I saw those 2 pink lines. I screamed so loud in that bathroom that Trevor came running, thinking something was wrong. When I showed him the test, his face did something strange. He smiled, hugged me, said all the right words, but his eyes looked trapped. I ignored that look, told myself I was imagining things, that he was just shocked, that he'd adjust. I wanted to believe the fantasy so badly that I refused to see reality standing right in front of me. The pregnancy was brutal from week 1. I couldn't keep food down for months, lost 12 pounds in the first trimester. My doctor put me on medication and strict meal plans. Trevor acted like my morning sickness was a personal inconvenience to him. He'd leave early for work to avoid hearing me throw up, come home late so he wouldn't have to help with dinner. By the second trimester, I developed high blood pressure. My doctor ordered bed rest, partial at first, then complete by month 7. I had to quit my job. Trevor said he understood, but I could feel his resentment growing like mold in the walls. He'd come home to a messy house and make comments about how I had all day to clean. Never mind that I was barely allowed to stand for more than 20 minutes at a time. Hannah, my best friend since college, became my lifeline. She'd come over with groceries, help me shower when I felt too weak, sit with me through the loneliness. She saw what was happening with Trevor before I was ready to admit it. One afternoon, she found me crying in bed after Trevor had snapped at me for asking him to pick up my prescription. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, held my hand, and said something I'll never forget. She told me I deserved better than a man who treated pregnancy like a burden instead of a partnership. I defended him, made excuses about work stress and financial pressure. But deep down, I knew she was right. The night I went into labor, Trevor was in Denver for a conference. I'd asked him weeks earlier not to go, reminded him I was 38 weeks and could deliver any day. He'd promised it would be fine, that first babies always come late, that his career couldn't wait for maybes. My water broke at 2 in the morning. I called him, hands shaking, contractions already starting. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, voice thick with sleep and something else. Alcohol, I realized later. He'd been at the hotel bar. I told him it was happening, that I needed him to come home. He sighed, actually sighed, and said the conference was important for his career, that he couldn't just leave. Then he asked if my mom could take me to the hospital. My mom had been dead for 2 years. Cancer, quick and cruel. Trevor had been at the funeral. He knew this. But in that moment, my dying in labor mattered less to him than missing a networking breakfast. I hung up and called Hannah. She was at my house in 15 minutes, helped me to her car, drove through red lights to get me to the hospital. She held my hand through intake, through the epidural, through 18 hours of hell. And when Aria finally came, when I heard that first cry and felt that overwhelming rush of love, Hannah was crying right along with me. Trevor showed up 6 hours later, smelling like whiskey and apologies. He had this rehearsed explanation about delayed flights and traffic, but I could see the guilt on his face. He hadn't rushed. He'd taken his time, maybe hoping it would all be over by the time he arrived. The nurse brought Aria over, this tiny, perfect bundle wrapped in pink. Trevor took her, awkward and stiff, and for a second I thought maybe seeing her would fix something in him. Maybe fatherhood would flip a switch and bring back the man I'd married. Instead, his face went pale. His jaw tightened. And then he said the words that would end everything. He asked why she was so dark. I didn't understand the question at first. My brain was foggy from exhaustion and medication, and I thought maybe I'd heard him wrong. But then Trevor repeated it, louder this time, looking straight at me with suspicion carved into every line of his face. He wanted to know why our daughter's skin was darker than ours, why her hair was thick and curly instead of straight, why she didn't look like what he'd expected. The room went cold. I could feel Hannah tense beside me, could see the nurse's expression shift from polite professionalism to barely concealed disgust. But all I could focus on was Trevor's face, the doubt, the accusation, the complete absence of love when he looked at our child. I tried to explain that babies' coloring changes in the first few weeks, that newborns often look different than they will later. My voice was shaking, pleading almost, and I hated myself for it. I shouldn't have had to defend myself in that moment. I just spent 18 hours bringing our daughter into the world while he was drinking at a hotel bar in Denver. But Trevor wasn't listening. He handed Aria back to the nurse like she was contaminated, stepped away from the bassinet, and said he wanted a DNA test. Right there in the delivery room, with me still bleeding and stitched and barely able to sit up, he accused me of cheating. I started crying then. Not because I was guilty. I knew the truth. Knew Aria was his. But because of how easily he believed I could betray him. 4 years of marriage, and he was ready to throw me away over a newborn's skin tone. That's when I realized he'd never really trusted me at all. Or maybe he had, but whatever trust existed wasn't strong enough to survive his prejudice. Hannah exploded. She's 5'3" and looks like she couldn't hurt a fly, but when she's angry, she's terrifying. She got in Trevor's face and told him exactly what she thought of a man who'd accuse his wife of infidelity, because he was too ignorant to understand basic genetics. She called him pathetic, cowardly, a dozen other things I was too tired to process. Trevor ignored her completely, just turned to the nurse and demanded the birth certificate papers, said he wouldn't sign anything without proof of paternity. The nurse looked horrified. She tried to explain that requesting DNA tests required different paperwork, that it wasn't something they could just do immediately, that maybe everyone should calm down and think clearly. But Trevor was adamant. He stood there with his arms crossed, looking at me like I was a stranger, and refused to budge. That's when the nurse left to get Dr. Patel, my obstetrician. The woman who'd guided me through 9 months of complicated pregnancy, who delivered Aria safely despite my blood pressure issues, who actually knew my medical history because she'd bothered to read it. While we waited, Trevor stood in the corner scrolling through his phone, not pacing, not apologizing, not even looking conflicted. Just checking emails like this was a minor inconvenience in his day. Meanwhile, I held Arya against my chest, felt her tiny heartbeat through the swaddle, and wondered how I'd ever convince myself this man loved me. Hannah sat on the edge of my bed, her hand on my shoulder, radiating fury. She whispered that she'd help me leave him, that I didn't have to stay, that Arya deserved better than a father who rejected her in her first hours of life. I knew she was right. But part of me still hoped, stupidly, desperately hoped, that this was shock, confusion, something that would pass once the truth came out. Dr. Patel walked in carrying a folder, her expression serious in a way I'd never seen before. She's usually warm and patient, always smiling during appointments, but now she looked at Trevor like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. She told him she understood his confusion, but that he needed to listen carefully. Trevor tried to interrupt with some defensive comment about his rights as a father, but Dr. Patel cut him off. Her voice was sharp, authoritative, the voice of someone who dealt with too many difficult men in her career. She opened the folder and pulled out papers covered in medical terminology and genetic markers. Then she asked me something that made the room spin. She asked if I knew I'd been adopted. I nodded. My mom had always been open about it, told me from the time I was little that she'd chosen me, that being adopted made me extra special. It was never a secret, never a source of shame, but I'd never searched for my birth family. My mom was my mom. Biology didn't change that. Dr. Patel explained that during my prenatal genetic screening, they'd found something significant. My blood work showed markers for substantial African American ancestry. I carried strong recessive genes for melanin production, hair texture, bone structure, traits that weren't visible in my phenotype but could absolutely express in my children. The silence in that room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear Arya's soft breathing, could hear Trevor's sharp intake of breath. Dr. Patel continued, her tone professional but pointed. She said Arya wasn't too dark or unexpected. She was simply expressing genes that I carried but didn't physically manifest. It was basic genetics, she said, textbook inheritance patterns, and it was all documented in my medical file from the 4th month of pregnancy. Then came the question that destroyed whatever excuse Trevor might have hidden behind. Dr. Patel looked straight at him and asked how many prenatal appointments he'd attended. Trevor's face went red. He stammered something about work obligations and demanding schedules. Dr. Patel didn't let him finish. She told him that the genetic screening results had been discussed, that I'd signed consent forms, that the information had been available to him at any point if he'd bothered to show up. The truth hung in the air like smoke. Trevor had missed 12 out of 15 appointments. He didn't know about the genetic screening because he'd never cared enough to learn. He'd been too busy building his career, networking at conferences, proving himself to colleagues who'd forget his name in 6 months. Hannah made a small noise beside me, something between a laugh and a sob. The nurse looked away, embarrassed for him. And I just stared at my husband, waiting to see if he'd apologize, if he'd show even a flicker of remorse. Instead, he asked if Arya was really his. Even with the scientific evidence, the documented medical history, the genetic explanation, he still questioned it. Dr. Patel's patience finally snapped. She told him yes. Biologically, Arya was his daughter. But then she said something that cut through all the clinical language and medical facts. She said paternity wasn't just genetics. It was showing up. It was holding your wife's hand through 18 hours of agony. It was knowing her medical history because you actually cared. Then she looked at me with something like pity and asked me to sign the necessary documents. And she turned back to Trevor with pure contempt in her eyes and told him to decide if he wanted to be a father or just a sperm donor. The room felt like it was closing in. Trevor stood there, caught between his prejudice and his pride, his ignorance and his obligation. Finally, he stepped forward and took Arya from my arms. He held her awkwardly like he'd never held a baby before, stared at her face for what felt like an eternity, and I watched his expression, desperate to see love break through the doubt. But what I saw instead was resignation, duty, a man checking a box on a list of things he was supposed to do. He handed her back without a word, walked to the table, and signed the birth certificate in silence. Then he muttered something about needing air and walked out. He didn't come back that night or the next. And in that hospital room, Holding my daughter while my best friend cried beside me, I finally understood the truth. Trevor didn't reject Aria because he doubted she was his. He rejected her because, deep down, he couldn't love a child who didn't match his image of what his family should look like. And that was something no DNA test could ever fix. Trevor showed up on the third day to drive us home. No apology, no flowers, no explanation for where he'd been. He just walked into that hospital room like nothing had happened, took our bags, and said the car was waiting downstairs. The ride back to our house in South Austin was suffocating. Hannah had wanted to come with us, but I'd told her I needed to face this alone. Stupid decision looking back. But I kept thinking maybe once we were home, once Trevor saw Aria in the nursery we'd painted together, something would click into place. It didn't. He carried the car seat inside, set it down in the living room, and immediately went to his office. Said he had emails to catch up on. I stood there with our 2-day-old daughter, my body still aching from delivery, and listened to him shut that door between us. That became our routine. Trevor would leave for work before Aria and I woke up. He'd come home after dark, eat whatever I'd managed to throw together, and disappear into his office or in front of the TV. When Aria cried, he'd put in headphones. When she needed a diaper change and I asked for help, he'd do it with this resigned expression, like I was asking him to clean a public bathroom. He never held her unless absolutely necessary, never sang to her, never talked to her in that soft voice parents use with newborns. When his mom called to ask about her granddaughter, Trevor handed me the phone without a word. I kept thinking he needed time to adjust. First-time parent jitters, maybe some postpartum depression. Men can get that too, right? I made excuses for him in my head, built elaborate justifications for why my husband couldn't look at his own daughter. But 3 weeks in, I found the messages. Trevor had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, something he never did. He was always paranoid about work security, always logging out and closing everything. But that morning, he'd rushed out for an early meeting and forgotten. I wasn't snooping. Not at first. I was just moving it to wipe down the counter when the screen lit up with a new message notification. A group chat with his college buddies, guys I'd met at our wedding, guys who'd seemed perfectly nice at the time. The preview was enough to make my stomach turn, but I clicked anyway. I needed to see the full context, needed to confirm what I already suspected. The messages went back weeks. Trevor had been venting to them since the day Aria was born, complaining that he couldn't connect with her, that every time he looked at her he remembered she wasn't what he'd expected. He said his daughter looked like she came from a different family. His friends responded with jokes I won't repeat, racist garbage dressed up as humor. And Trevor laughed along, sent back emoji reactions, encouraged it. One message stopped my heart completely. One of his friends asked if he'd considered leaving, starting over with someone else. And Trevor responded that he'd thought about it, but didn't want to look like the bad guy. That he was stuck now, might as well make the best of it. Stuck. He saw our daughter as a trap. I read through months of messages, my hands shaking so hard I could barely scroll. This wasn't confusion or adjustment or shock. This was disgust. Trevor was repulsed by his own child because her skin was darker than his white picket fence fantasy. I took photos of everything with my phone. Every vile message, every racist joke, every complaint about being trapped in a life he didn't want. I didn't know what I'd do with them yet, but some instinct told me I'd need proof later. That night, when Trevor came home, I had Aria asleep in her bassinet upstairs and my laptop open on the kitchen table. I'd transferred all the screenshots, had them ready to show him. He walked in, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and started talking about his day like we were a normal couple. Some story about a difficult client and a missed deadline. I let him finish, let him settle into his chair across from me, take a long drink, relax into the illusion that everything was fine. Then I turned the laptop around and showed him his own words. His face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. Surprise, anger, fear, defensiveness, and finally something like resignation. He tried to play it off, said it was just guy talk, that everyone vents to their friends, that I was overreacting. I told him I wasn't asking for an explanation. I was telling him a fact. He didn't love our daughter, he was ashamed of her, and I wasn't going to raise Aria in a house where she could feel that rejection every single day. Trevor got defensive then, raised his voice, said I was being dramatic, that he was trying his best, that fatherhood was hard for everyone, that I should be grateful he'd stayed at all. That last part gave him away. He'd just admitted what the messages had already shown. He'd considered leaving, was still considering it. He was only here out of obligation and fear of judgment. I stood up, walked to the bassinet, looked down at Arya's perfect sleeping face. Her tiny fingers curled into fists, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She had no idea her father couldn't stand the sight of her. She was innocent in all this, caught between my blind hope and his poisonous prejudice. When I turned back to Trevor, I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been bending finally snapped into place. I told him he needed to leave. Not forever, we'd figure out the legal stuff later. But for tonight, I needed him gone. I couldn't look at him anymore without seeing those messages, without hearing him call our daughter a mistake, a trap, something that happened to him instead of someone he'd created. Trevor stood up, grabbed his keys, and said I'd regret this, that I was throwing away our marriage over nothing, that I'd end up alone, struggling, begging him to come back. I didn't argue, just waited by the door until he left, locked it behind him, and went upstairs to hold my daughter. Hannah came over an hour later. I'd texted her everything. She brought wine for me and righteous anger for both of us. We sat in the nursery, Arya between us in her bassinet, and Hannah said what I'd been too scared to admit out loud. She said Trevor was never going to change, that this wasn't about adjustment or time or understanding. It was about who he was at his core. Someone who valued image over love. Someone whose prejudice ran deeper than his marriage vows. I knew she was right. But knowing something and accepting it are different things. Part of me still wanted to believe we could fix this, that counseling or time or some miracle would make Trevor into the father Arya deserved. That part of me was an idiot. Trevor came back 2 days later, apologetic and promising to do better. Said he'd been stressed and overwhelmed, that he'd said things he didn't mean. He held Arya for exactly 90 seconds while I watched, and I could see the performance in every movement. He was acting, playing the role of repentant husband and father, hoping I'd buy it long enough for things to go back to normal. But I'd seen behind the curtain. I knew what he really thought, what he really felt, and I couldn't unsee it. I told him we needed marriage counseling. He agreed immediately, too immediately, like he'd expected me to ask and had already prepared his cooperative response. We found a therapist, scheduled sessions, showed up, and sat on opposite ends of a beige couch, while a kind woman named Dr. Morrison tried to mediate between us. Trevor performed beautifully in those sessions, talked about wanting to connect with Arya, about struggling with the transition to fatherhood, about communication issues in our marriage. He said all the right things, made all the right promises. Dr. Morrison seemed encouraged, but at home, nothing changed. He still avoided Arya, still spent all his time in his office or out with friends, still looked at our daughter like she was evidence of something shameful. I gave it 6 weeks. 6 weeks of therapy and false hope and watching Trevor pretend to try. 6 weeks of feeling Arya grow heavier in my arms while her father couldn't be bothered to hold her for more than a photo op. Then I called a divorce attorney. Her name was Patricia Chen, and Hannah had recommended her after a quick search for the best family lawyers in Austin. Patricia was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She listened to my story, looked at the screenshots I'd saved, and asked me one question. She asked if I was ready to fight. I looked down at Arya sleeping in her carrier at my feet. Thought about those messages, that hospital room, the months of rejection and disgust masquerading as marriage. Thought about the years ahead, the damage Trevor would do if I let him stay. The lesson Arya would learn about her own worth if she grew up watching her father tolerate her instead of love her. And I told Patricia yes. I was ready. Patricia didn't waste time. Within 48 hours of our first meeting, she drafted divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and requesting primary custody of Arya with minimal visitation for Trevor. She wanted documentation of everything. The messages, the hospital incident, witness statements from anyone who'd seen Trevor's behavior. Hannah wrote a 3-page statement about what happened in that delivery room. Dr. Patel provided medical records that showed Trevor had missed nearly all my prenatal appointments. The nurse who'd witnessed his accusation submitted her own account. Even Trevor's mother, when I finally told her what happened, sent me a tearful email saying she'd support whatever I decided. Patricia explained that Texas was a no-fault divorce state, which meant I didn't have to prove Trevor did anything wrong to end the marriage. But for custody, character mattered. And Trevor's character, when laid out in black and white across legal documents, looked exactly as ugly as it felt. I filed the papers on a Tuesday morning. Trevor was served at his office that afternoon. He called me within an hour, furious, demanding to know why I was doing this, why I couldn't just work things out like adults. I told him we'd tried, that therapy was his performance, not his effort, that I wasn't raising my daughter in a home where her own father saw her as a burden. He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said if I wanted to play hardball, he could play too. That he had resources I didn't, connections I'd never match, that I'd regret backing him into a corner. I hung up and immediately called Patricia. She told me not to engage with him directly anymore, that all communication should go through lawyers from now on. She also warned me that men like Trevor, when cornered, often got desperate, that I should be prepared for him to lash out. She was right. 2 days later, Trevor's attorney filed a counterclaim requesting 50-50 custody and alleging that I was an unfit mother. The document claimed I suffered from postpartum depression, which I didn't, and that I was alienating Aria from her father out of spite. It painted me as unstable, vindictive, using our daughter as a weapon in a petty conflict. Reading those accusations felt like being punched. Everything he claimed I was doing, he'd actually done. The projection was so obvious it was almost funny. Almost. Patricia wasn't worried. She said desperate people make desperate arguments, and that Trevor's claims would fall apart under scrutiny. But we needed more evidence of his neglect, more proof that his interest in custody was about control, not love. That's when I remembered the baby monitor. We'd installed cameras in Aria's nursery when she was born, standard video monitors with cloud recording. I'd set them up because of my anxiety about SIDS wanting to watch her breathe while she slept. But those cameras had been recording everything for 2 months. I pulled up the footage and started reviewing. Hours and hours of recorded time, most of it just Aria sleeping or me tending to her. But scattered throughout were moments I'd forgotten or missed in real time. There was Trevor walking past her crying in the crib without stopping. Trevor on his phone while she screamed for a diaper change until I came running from the shower. Trevor picking her up with such obvious disgust on his face that even grainy security footage couldn't hide it. The worst clip was from 3 weeks earlier. I'd asked Trevor to watch Aria for 20 minutes while I ran to the pharmacy. The camera showed him putting her in the crib, turning on white noise, and leaving the room. She woke up 5 minutes later and cried for the entire 15 minutes I was gone. Trevor never came back. When I got home, I found him in the living room with noise-canceling headphones on, watching TV. I sent everything to Patricia. She called me that night, her voice careful and controlled, and told me this was exactly what we needed. Visual proof of neglect, of a father who couldn't be bothered to comfort his own crying infant, even when she was his sole responsibility. But she also warned me that this evidence would hurt him badly in court, that once we submitted it, there was no going back, no chance of reconciliation. She wanted to make sure I was certain. I thought about Aria, about the person she'd become if she grew up thinking love was conditional on appearance. I thought about Trevor's messages, his accusations in that hospital room, his complete inability to see our daughter as anything but a disappointment. And I told Patricia to file everything. Trevor's response came fast and vicious. His lawyer accused me of illegal surveillance, of violating privacy laws, of manufacturing evidence. They threatened countersuits and criminal complaints. It was all bluster. Patricia had already confirmed Texas law allowed recording in your own home. But it showed me how far Trevor would go to avoid accountability. Meanwhile, I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep a night, taking care of a 2-month-old alone, and trying to keep my freelance design work going enough to pay bills. Patricia had filed for temporary spousal support and child support, but court dates were months away. Trevor had frozen our joint accounts the day he was served, leaving me with whatever was in my personal checking, about $800. Hannah moved in to help. She took the guest room, split bills with me, watched Aria while I worked. Her presence kept me sane. Some nights I'd break down crying after putting Aria to bed, overwhelmed by the legal battle and financial stress and sheer exhaustion. Hannah would sit with me, remind me why I was doing this, tell me I was stronger than I thought. She was also the one who discovered Trevor's mistake. One afternoon, while I was feeding Aria, Hannah was scrolling through Facebook and saw that Trevor had posted a photo. Him at some brewery with friends, big smile, craft beer in hand, caption about enjoying freedom and living his best life. The post was public, and it was dated from the same day he'd filed his counterclaim, alleging he was a devoted father being kept from his child. Hannah showed me, her eyes lit up with vindictive satisfaction. Here was Trevor broadcasting to the world that he was perfectly happy without Arya, while simultaneously telling a court he was desperately fighting for custody. I screenshotted everything and sent it to Patricia. She responded with 3 words: "He's an idiot." That post became Exhibit 12 in our custody filing, and it was just the beginning of Trevor's social media self-destruction. Over the next few weeks, he posted regularly. Photos from a weekend trip to Colorado, check-ins at expensive restaurants, comments on friends' posts about how great single life was treating him. Every post contradicted his legal claims of being a heartbroken father. Patricia used every single one. She built a timeline showing that in the 8 weeks since I'd filed for divorce, Trevor had visited Arya exactly twice, both times for less than an hour, both times with his lawyer present documenting his attempts to be involved. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Trevor's sister called me out of the blue on a Saturday morning. Lauren and I had never been particularly close. She lived in Seattle, and we'd only met a handful of times. But her voice on the phone was tight with anger. She told me Trevor had called her asking for a character witness statement for court. During that conversation, he'd admitted he was fighting for custody purely for financial reasons. That keeping 50-50 custody meant paying less child support. That he had no intention of actually taking care of Arya, he'd just hire a nanny for his weekends. Lauren was horrified. She said she'd always suspected Trevor had inherited their father's prejudices, but never wanted to believe it. Hearing him dismiss his own daughter as a financial calculation made her sick. She asked if I wanted her statement for my case instead. I almost cried right there on the phone. Told her yes, absolutely, and gave her Patricia's contact information. Lauren sent a detailed affidavit that afternoon. In it, she described Trevor's comments, his admission of using custody as a financial strategy, and her own observations of his behavior around Arya during her one visit to meet her niece. Lauren wrote that Trevor had held Arya for less than 5 minutes total during her 3-day visit, that he'd made uncomfortable comments about Arya's appearance, that when Lauren had gushed about how beautiful her niece was, Trevor had changed the subject. Patricia called it a nuclear bomb. Having Trevor's own sister testify against him destroyed any argument that I was the one poisoning people against him. The preliminary custody hearing was scheduled for mid-October, when Arya would be 4 months old. Patricia was confident. We had documented neglect, contradictory social media, witness testimony from family and medical professionals, and Trevor's own words from those group chat messages. But she warned me that family court was unpredictable, that judges sometimes bent over backwards to keep fathers in children's lives, even bad fathers, that I should prepare for the possibility of shared custody regardless of the evidence. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I kept Arya in bed with me, held her close, whispered promises that I'd protect her no matter what the court decided. She was so small, so perfect, so completely unaware that her entire future was about to be determined by strangers in a courtroom. Hannah drove us to the courthouse the next morning. Patricia met us outside, impeccable in a navy suit, carrying a briefcase thick with documentation. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to stay calm, let her do the talking, and trust the process. Trevor was already inside with his attorney, a slick-looking man in his 40s named Richard Banks, who apparently specialized in defending men in custody battles. I'd looked him up. His website bragged about keeping fathers' rights intact even in difficult circumstances. Reading between the lines, that meant he was good at making neglectful fathers look better than they were. We sat on opposite sides of the courtroom. Trevor wouldn't look at me, just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, radiating hostility. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holloway. Patricia had said that was good. Female judges were statistically more likely to believe mothers in custody disputes, but Judge Holloway's expression was unreadable as she reviewed our files. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Patricia presented our evidence methodically: the hospital incident, the messages, the video footage, Lauren's statement. Trevor's attorney tried to spin everything as miscommunication or stress or my vindictive manipulation. Then Judge Holloway asked Trevor directly why he wanted 50-50 custody. He gave a rehearsed answer about loving his daughter, wanting to be present in her life, believing she needed both parents. It sounded good, almost convincing. But then Judge Holloway asked him Arya's pediatrician's name. Trevor hesitated. You could see him trying to remember, grasping for information that should have been automatic. After 5 long seconds, he admitted he didn't know. Judge Holloway asked when Aria's last checkup was, what time she usually went to bed, what her favorite toy was, whether she had any food allergies. Trevor couldn't answer a single question. I watched his attorney's face fall, watched Trevor realize his performance had just crumbled under the simplest possible test of parental involvement. Judge Holloway closed her folder and made her ruling right there. Primary custody to me, visitation for Trevor, 1 supervised weekend per month until Aria was 2 years old, at which point we'd revisit. Child support calculated based on Texas guidelines, and a stern warning to Trevor that if he missed visits or failed to pay support, there would be consequences. Trevor's face went red. His lawyer started to object, but Judge Holloway cut him off. She said she'd seen enough absent fathers pretending to care for financial or ego reasons, that Aria deserved better than being a pawn in her father's games. We walked out of that courthouse into October sunshine, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Trevor had 1 supervised visit scheduled for 2 weeks later. He never showed up, or for the next one, or the one after that. 3 missed visits in. Patricia filed a motion to modify the custody agreement to supervise visitation upon request rather than scheduled, which meant Trevor had to actually ask to see Aria instead of having default weekends. The motion was granted without opposition. Trevor never requested a visit. The child support payments started coming through in November. Automatic withdrawals from Trevor's account to mine, court-ordered and consistent. It wasn't enough to live comfortably, but combined with my freelance work and Hannah's help with rent, we made it work. Trevor and I hadn't spoken directly in 6 weeks. All communication went through lawyers, mostly just Patricia forwarding me updates about paperwork or financial disclosures. He'd started dating someone new. I knew because his social media was still public, still broadcasting his life like a performance. Her name was Jessica, blonde and polished. Exactly what I imagined Trevor had always wanted. Part of me felt relieved seeing those posts. It meant he was moving on, building the life he actually wanted, instead of the one he'd felt trapped in. Maybe this new woman would give him the white picket fence family he'd dreamed of, and he'd finally leave us alone. But another part of me, the part that still remembered loving him, that had spent 4 years believing we'd build something together, felt gutted, because it proved what I'd suspected all along. Trevor wasn't incapable of commitment or fatherhood. He just couldn't commit to a daughter who didn't match his expectations. He could absolutely be present and devoted, just not for Aria. Hannah found me crying in the kitchen one night after seeing a photo of Trevor and Jessica at some holiday party. She didn't say anything, just wrapped her arms around me and let me sob into her shoulder. When I finally pulled away, she asked what I needed. I told her the truth. I needed this to be over. Not just the legal stuff that was basically done. I needed closure. I needed to stop caring what Trevor did or who he dated or what kind of father he might be to his future children. Hannah said something then that shifted everything. She said maybe closure wasn't about Trevor at all. Maybe it was about me deciding what story I was going to tell Aria when she got old enough to ask about her father. That question haunted me, because Aria would ask eventually. She'd want to know why her daddy didn't visit, why he wasn't in photos, why other kids had fathers and she didn't. And I'd have to find words that were honest but not cruel, that protected her without lying. I started seeing a therapist, not couples counseling this time, just individual sessions with a woman named Dr. Reeves, who specialized in helping parents navigate difficult situations. I told her everything: the hospital, the rejection, the divorce, my fear that Aria would blame herself somehow for Trevor's absence. Dr. Reeves told me something I needed to hear. She said children are remarkably resilient when they feel loved, that Aria wouldn't grow up damaged by Trevor's absence if she grew up surrounded by people who chose to love her completely. The wound wouldn't come from missing him, it would come from feeling unwanted. My job wasn't to make Trevor want her, it was to make sure she never doubted she was wanted by everyone else in her life. That conversation freed something in me. I stopped checking Trevor's social media, stopped wondering if he thought about Aria, stopped hoping he'd suddenly transform into the father she deserved. He'd made his choice. Now I needed to make mine, to build a life so full of love that his absence was just an empty space, not a gaping hole. Around the same time, I reconnected with my adoption agency, the same one my mom had used 27 years earlier. I'd never been interested in finding my birth family before. My mom was my family. Full stop. But after everything with Dr. Patel's revelation about my genetics, I got curious about where I came from. The agency had limited information. My birth mother had been 17, had chosen closed adoption, hadn't left contact information. But they did have medical history. And reading through it felt like looking in a mirror I'd never known existed. My birth mother was black. My birth father was white. They'd been high school sweethearts from different worlds, and when she got pregnant, both families had rejected them. She'd chosen adoption not because she didn't want me, but because she wanted me to have stability she couldn't provide at 17. The file included a letter she'd written to her future child. To me. I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. She wrote about loving me enough to let me go, about hoping I'd understand someday, about wishing things could be different. She wrote that I was beautiful, that I had her grandmother's eyes and my father's smile, that she'd held me for 2 hours after I was born, memorizing my face, before the social worker took me to my adoptive parents. Reading that letter, I understood something crucial. My birth mother had loved me completely while looking exactly like me. She'd chosen adoption out of love, not shame. And somewhere in my genetic code was her resilience, her strength, her ability to make impossible choices for someone else's benefit. I thought about Arya, about the grandmother she'd never meet, but whose blood ran through both of us. I thought about the generations of black women who'd loved their children fiercely, despite a world that tried to diminish them. And I realized Arya wasn't just mine. She was part of a legacy I was only beginning to understand. I started researching my heritage, learning about the culture I carried but hadn't been raised in. I bought books about black hair care so I'd know how to take care of Arya's curls as she grew. I found a black pediatrician who could speak to experiences I couldn't. I joined a support group for transracial adoptees raising black children. Hannah watched this transformation with quiet support. One night, after I'd spent 2 hours watching YouTube tutorials on detangling natural hair, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay. That for the first time since that hospital room, I felt like I knew what I was doing. Not perfectly. I'd make mistakes. I'd have to keep learning, but I was trying. Actually trying, not just hoping things would work out. Trevor called unexpectedly in early December. Not through lawyers, but directly to my phone. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice was stiff, formal. He said he wanted to officially terminate his parental rights, that he'd talked to his attorney and there was a legal process for voluntary termination. He'd pay child support until Arya turned 18 as required, but he wanted out completely. No visits, no future contact, no ties. He said it would be better for everyone, for me to move on, for him to start fresh, for Arya to grow up without the confusion of an absent father popping in and out. I asked him if he was sure. Gave him one last chance to choose differently, even though I knew he wouldn't take it. He said he was certain that this was the right thing to do. I told him I'd talk to Patricia about the paperwork. Then, before hanging up, I said something I'd been holding in for months. I told him he was missing out on knowing the most incredible person I'd ever met, that Arya was smart and funny and resilient, that she'd inherited strength from women he'd never understand, that someday, when she accomplished amazing things, he'd see it from a distance and realize what he'd thrown away. And then I told him I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I refused to carry his prejudice like a weight for the rest of my life. Trevor was silent for a long moment. Then he said goodbye and hung up. Patricia filed the termination paperwork 2 days later. The court date was set for February, 3 months away. If approved, Trevor would have no legal relationship to Arya beyond financial support. She'd be entirely mine. I should have felt sad about it, this final, permanent severing of the family I'd tried to build. But instead, I felt relief, because sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is step aside when they can't give their child what they need. And Arya? She'd never remember Trevor anyway. Her first memories would be of Hannah making her laugh, of me singing off-key lullabies, of being surrounded by people who chose her deliberately and loved her fiercely. She'd grow up knowing she was wanted, not by everyone, but by the people who mattered. The termination hearing was scheduled for February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. The day celebrating love would be the day Trevor officially gave up any claim to loving his daughter. Patricia had warned me these hearings were usually straightforward when both parties agreed. We'd walk in, the judge would confirm Trevor understood what he was signing away, and that would be it. Clean, simple, final. But I was still nervous. Something about making it official, standing in a courtroom while a judge declared that Arya legally had no father, felt heavier than I'd expected. Hannah took the day off work to come with me. We got Arya ready that morning. She was 6 months old now, sitting up on her own, babbling constantly, the happiest baby I'd ever seen. Hannah had bought her a little red dress for the occasion, said if we had to go to court on Valentine's Day, at least Arya should look festive. We arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. Patricia was waiting outside, professional as always, but I could see concern in her eyes. She pulled me aside while Hannah entertained Arya on a bench. She told me Trevor's attorney had called that morning. Trevor wanted to address the court directly before the termination was finalized. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Richard Banks had assured Patricia it wasn't an attempt to block the termination. Trevor just wanted to make a statement. My stomach dropped. After months of silence, of going through lawyers for every communication, Trevor suddenly wanted to speak. Patricia must have seen my panic because she grabbed my hand and told me he couldn't stop this process now. The paperwork was filed, both parties had agreed. Whatever he said was just words, but words could still hurt. We walked into the courtroom 15 minutes later. Trevor was already there with Richard, sitting at the defendant's table in a suit I'd never seen before. He looked thinner than I remembered. Older somehow. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something unexpected in his face. Not anger or resentment. Something closer to shame. Judge Holloway entered, the same judge from our custody hearing. She recognized us immediately, gave me a small nod that felt almost sympathetic. She reviewed the termination petition quickly, confirmed the details, then looked at Trevor. She asked if he understood that terminating his parental rights meant giving up all legal claims to Arya permanently, that he'd have no say in her education, her health care, her life, that he couldn't change his mind in 5 or 10 years when it became convenient. Trevor stood up, his voice steady but quiet. He said he understood completely. Judge Holloway asked why he was choosing termination over simply remaining an absent father with visitation rights he never used. That's when Trevor asked permission to make his statement. The judge allowed it. Trevor cleared his throat, glanced at his attorney, then turned to face me directly for the first time in months. He said he owed me an apology, that nothing he could say would undo the damage he'd caused, but he needed to try anyway. He talked about the hospital, about his accusation, and his rejection of Arya. He admitted he'd been raised in a household where certain prejudices were normal, where his father made racist comments disguised as jokes, where difference was treated as something suspicious. He said he'd thought he'd outgrown that upbringing, but when Arya was born looking different than he'd expected, all those ugly beliefs surfaced. He said he'd spent 6 months in therapy trying to understand why he couldn't love his own daughter. His therapist had helped him see that the problem wasn't Arya. It was him. That he carried biases so deep he hadn't even recognized them as biases. And that trying to force himself to be a father while holding those beliefs would only hurt Arya more. He said he was choosing termination because Arya deserved better than a father who had to work at loving her. She deserved someone who saw her and felt nothing but pride and joy. He couldn't be that person. Maybe he'd never be that person. And the kindest thing he could do was admit it and step away. Then he did something I didn't expect. He apologized to Arya directly. He turned toward where Hannah was sitting with her in the back row and said he was sorry. Sorry he wasn't strong enough to overcome his own damage. Sorry she'd grow up without a father because of his failures. Sorry that she'd someday learn her dad chose to leave rather than choosing to change. He said he hoped she'd grow up happy and loved, surrounded by better people than him, and that if she ever wanted to know why he left, he hoped someone would tell her it was never her fault, that she was perfect, that the flaw was in him. The courtroom was dead silent when he finished. Judge Holloway stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she asked him one question. She asked if he'd considered that therapy could help him change, that he didn't have to let his prejudices win. Trevor nodded slowly. He said he'd thought about that. But therapy took years, and Arya was growing up now. Every month he stayed in her life half-heartedly was a month she'd sense his reluctance. Children knew when they weren't wanted. He didn't want to be the source of that pain. Judge Holloway made a small sound, not quite agreement, but understanding. She looked down at her papers, then at me. She asked if I had anything to say before she finalized the termination. I stood up, my legs shaking. Patricia had told me I didn't have to speak, that I could let the paperwork speak for itself. But standing there listening to Trevor's confession, I realized I needed to say something too. I told the judge that I appreciated Trevor's honesty, his acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused. But I also needed to be honest about something. I said that Trevor was right. Aria did deserve better. She deserved a father who loved her automatically, who saw her face and felt nothing but wonder. But since she wouldn't have that, she'd have something else. She'd have a mother who'd fight for her every single day. She'd have a chosen family who picked her deliberately. She'd have a community that would teach her she was beautiful, valuable, worthy, not despite who she was, but because of it. I said I'd tell Aria about her father someday. I'd be honest but kind. I'd explain that sometimes people aren't capable of the love we deserve, and that their limitations don't define our worth. And I said that I forgave Trevor for what happened in that hospital, for the months of rejection, for all of it. Not because he'd earned forgiveness, but because Aria would grow up in a house where forgiveness was possible, where we didn't carry hate like an inheritance. Then I looked directly at Trevor and told him I hoped he got the help he needed, that I hoped someday he'd work through his prejudices enough that they didn't poison his other relationships. But that work needed to happen far away from my daughter. Judge Holloway nodded slowly. She signed the termination order right there, stamped it official, and declared that as of February 14th, Trevor Brennan was no longer the legal father of Aria Brennan. She added one more thing. She said that in 20 years presiding over family court, she'd seen a lot of parents make terrible choices, but she'd rarely seen someone honest enough to admit they were making one. She told Trevor she hoped he meant what he'd said about getting help, and she told me that Aria was lucky to have a mother willing to fight this hard for her. Then she dismissed us. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. The legal battle was over. Trevor was gone permanently, cleanly, officially. There'd be no more court dates, no more lawyers, no more wondering if he'd suddenly decide to be involved again. Hannah met me outside with Aria in her arms. My daughter was chewing on her fist, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire legal reality had just changed. She saw me and broke into the biggest smile, reaching her little arms out. I took her, held her close, breathed in that baby smell that was already fading as she got older. And for the first time since that hospital room, I felt genuine peace. Trevor walked past us without stopping, heading to his car with Richard beside him. He glanced back once, his eyes meeting mine for just a second. I saw regret there, maybe even grief, but I also saw relief. We were both free now. Free to build the lives we actually wanted instead of the one we'd tried to force into existence. Patricia came out a few minutes later, smiling wider than I'd ever seen her. She said it was done, that she'd file the final paperwork that afternoon, that I should receive official copies within 2 weeks. Then she hugged me, something she'd never done before, and told me she was proud of me. Hannah drove us home through afternoon traffic. Aria fell asleep in her car seat, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. I watched her in the mirror, this perfect little person who had no idea she'd just lost and gained everything in the same day. Lost a father who couldn't love her, gained complete freedom from his rejection. When we got home, Hannah made dinner while I put Aria down for her nap. I stood in the doorway of her nursery, watching her sleep, thinking about the future. She'd grow up with questions. She'd notice other kids had dads and she didn't. She'd wonder why, maybe blame herself despite everything I told her. Those were inevitable wounds, scars she'd carry because of Trevor's choices. But she'd also grow up knowing she was chosen, that every person in her life, me, Hannah, her pediatrician, her future teachers and friends and mentors, they'd all be there because they wanted to be, not because biology obligated them, because they saw her and loved what they saw. That night, after Aria was asleep and Hannah had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with a glass of wine and finally let myself cry. Not sad tears, releasing tears, letting go of the marriage I'd thought I had, the family I'd tried to build, the man I'd believed Trevor was, All of it had been an illusion. But what remained was real. Arya was real. My love for her was real. And that was enough. It was more than enough. 2 years have passed since that Valentine's Day hearing. Arya's almost 3 now, talking in full sentences, asking a million questions about everything. She loves dinosaurs and refuses to wear anything that isn't purple. She has her grandmother's eyes, my birth mother's eyes, and the most infectious laugh I've ever heard. She doesn't ask about her father yet. Sometimes she notices other kids at the park with their dads and looks curious, but she doesn't seem to feel like anything's missing. Her world is full enough without him. Hannah's still living with us. We found a bigger place last year, a small house in East Austin with a backyard where Arya can run around. Hannah has the master bedroom. I have the second. And Arya's room is painted like a jungle with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. It's chaotic and beautiful, and nothing like the life I'd planned. It's better. People ask sometimes if Hannah and I are together romantically. The answer's no, but I understand the confusion. We're partners in every way that matters. Splitting bills, making decisions about Arya together, supporting each other through bad days, and celebrating the good ones. We're family. Not the traditional kind, but family nonetheless. My design business grew over the past 2 years. Turns out being a single mother makes you incredibly efficient with time. I work during Arya's naps and after bedtime, take client calls while she plays beside me, have learned to design with one hand while holding a toddler with the other. I'm making more now than I did before the divorce. Trevor's child support still comes through automatically every month. I put it directly into a college fund for Arya. She'll have options when she's older, opportunities I didn't have. His money can do that much at least. I heard through mutual friends that Trevor married Jessica last fall. They're expecting a baby this summer. Part of me wondered if I'd feel something when I heard that news. Jealousy, anger, something. But I just felt nothing. He's living his life. I'm living mine. Those lives don't intersect anymore. I did wonder if he'd be different with this new baby. If he'd show up to prenatal appointments, hold his child in the delivery room without suspicion, love without conditions. I hope so. Not for his sake. For that kid's sake. Every child deserves a father who wants them. But if he's not different, if he fails this new family the way he failed us, that's not my problem to solve. I spent too many months trying to fix Trevor, trying to make him into someone he wasn't. I won't waste energy on that anymore. The hardest moment came 6 months ago. Arya was at a play date with another little girl from her daycare when the girl's father showed up for pickup. Arya watched him swing his daughter into the air, both of them laughing, and I saw something shift in her expression. On the drive home, she asked me where her daddy was. I'd prepared for this question. Had practiced different versions of the answer with Dr. Reeves, trying to find words that were honest without being cruel. But actually sitting there with my 2-year-old looking at me with those big, curious eyes, all my preparation evaporated. I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. I said her daddy wasn't able to be a good daddy, so he decided it was better to let other people love her instead, that it wasn't her fault. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they can't fix, and that she had so many people who loved her so much that there wasn't room to feel sad about the one person who couldn't. Arya thought about this for a minute, then asked if Hannah was her daddy. I laughed, couldn't help it, told her no, Hannah was Hannah, Auntie Hannah. But that Hannah loved her just as much as any daddy could. Arya seemed satisfied with that answer. She hasn't asked about Trevor since. Maybe she will again when she's older, when the questions get more complicated. But for now, she's okay. And watching her be okay, seeing her thrive despite his absence, proved something I'd needed to believe. Children really are resilient when they feel loved. I've stayed connected with the transracial adoptee support group, being around other people navigating similar situations, white parents raising black children, adoptees discovering their heritage, families that don't look like the default, helped me understand I wasn't alone in figuring this out. One woman in the group, Maria, became a close friend. Her son is 6 months older than Arya, and watching him grow up confident and proud of his identity gave me hope for what Arya's future could look like. Maria taught me about protecting Arya from racism she'd inevitably face, about building her up so that rejection from people like Trevor wouldn't define her self-worth. Through Maria, I found a black hairstylist named Kenya who's been teaching me how to care for Arya's curls properly. Every Saturday morning, we go to Kenya's salon, and while she works magic on Arya's hair, she tells stories about black women in her family, the pride and history carried in every coil and curl. Arya loves these mornings. She leaves the salon walking taller, touching her hair with pride. These are the things Trevor's missing. These moments of joy and growth and connection. Arya learning about her heritage, understanding she's part of something bigger than just our small family. She's connected to generations of strong women who loved fiercely and survived impossible things. Last month, I got a message from the adoption agency. My birth mother had updated her contact preferences. After 27 years of maintaining a closed adoption, she'd changed her mind. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to meet. I stared at that message for 3 days before responding. Part of me was terrified. What if she was disappointed in who I'd become? What if meeting ruined the idealized image I'd built from her letter? But another part of me desperately wanted Arya to know this woman, to meet her great-grandmother, to understand where we came from. I wrote back, yes, we're meeting next month. Just coffee at first, somewhere neutral and public. The agency counselor said to keep expectations low, that reunions could be complicated and emotional. But I couldn't help feeling hopeful. Arya would have a grandmother, not through marriage or obligation, but through blood and choice. Someone who could tell her stories about our family, our history, someone else who'd chosen love over fear. Whatever happens in that coffee shop, I know we'll be okay. Arya and I have survived worse than awkward first meetings. Sometimes late at night, after Arya's asleep and the house is quiet, I think about that hospital room, about holding my newborn daughter while her father rejected her, feeling like my world was ending. I remember the fear, the heartbreak, the desperate hope that somehow everything would work out. I was right to be afraid. Everything I'd built did fall apart. My marriage ended. The family I'd imagined disappeared. The future I'd planned for evaporated. But in its place, something better grew. Something real and solid and chosen. A family that didn't exist because of biology or tradition, but because we picked each other deliberately. Arya will grow up knowing that love isn't automatic. That family isn't just whoever shares your DNA. That sometimes the people who are supposed to love you can't, and that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitations. She'll also grow up knowing she was fought for. That when someone tried to reject her, I chose her instead. That her mother loved her enough to blow up her entire life, rather than raise her in a house where she felt unwanted. That's the story I'll tell her someday when she asks about her father. Not that he was evil or terrible. He was just broken in ways he couldn't fix. And instead of letting his brokenness hurt her, he stepped away. It was the only kind thing he ever did for her. But the story won't end with him. It'll end with us, with Hannah and me, and Kenya, and Maria, and Dr. Reeves, and every person who saw Arya and chose to love her completely. It'll end with a little girl who grew up surrounded by chosen family, who learned that love is about showing up, about staying, about picking someone every single day. Last week, Arya told me I was her best friend. We were at the park, pushing her on the swings, and she just turned around mid-swing and shouted it with complete joy. That I was her best friend and she loved me bigger than the sky. I wanted to freeze that moment, hold on to it forever, because that's what matters. Not the man who left, not the family we lost, not the pain we survived. What matters is that my daughter feels loved, completely, unconditionally, fiercely loved. And she does. She absolutely does. So to anyone out there going through something similar, maybe you're in that hospital room right now, or maybe you're months into a divorce you never wanted, or maybe you're just wondering if you're strong enough to leave someone who doesn't love your child the way they should, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. Your child is more resilient than you fear. And sometimes the family you build is better than the one you planned. I thought my life ended the day Trevor rejected Arya. But it didn't end. It just finally started. If you've been following along this whole time, thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share this story, for witnessing the hardest and best moments of my life. It means more than you know to have people who understand. And if you're watching from wherever you are in the world, I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from. It helps to know I'm not alone in this, that somewhere out there, someone else understands what it's like to rebuild your life from scratch. If you want to keep following these stories, make sure you're subscribed. There are so many more to tell. Stories about survival and strength in families that don't look like the default, but work anyway. Because that's what we do. We survive. We rebuild. We love our children fiercely enough that someone else's rejection becomes irrelevant. And we tell our stories so other people know they can survive too.